What would you do if standing up for what's right meant losing everything? One pilot made a split-second decision that put him on a collision course with one of the most powerful men in America: corruption, betrayal, and a fight for justice. This is the story of how a man who once ruled the skies brought down a king. Stay with us, because this one is personal. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The hum of jet engines and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the crisp morning air at Miami International Airport. Rhett Calloway adjusted the cuffs of his uniform as he walked across the tarmac, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. He had always loved this part, the quiet moments before a flight, when everything was still in perfect order. Today's flight was different, not because of the destination — Los Angeles was a routine route — but because of the passengers. A group of high-profile business executives had booked this private jet, and that meant one thing: perfection was expected. No mistakes, no delays. Stepping into the hangar, Rhett was met with the sight of his aircraft, a sleek white Gulfstream, its fuselage gleaming under the morning sun. He exhaled slowly, taking in the view. Flying had been his dream since childhood, and now at 27, he had carved a place for himself in the world of private aviation. But the road here had been anything but smooth. "Morning, Calloway," came a voice from behind him. Rhett turned to see Captain Lawrence Beckett, his senior on today's flight. A veteran in the industry, Beckett had the air of someone who had seen it all and cared for none of it. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. "Everything set?" Beckett asked, his eyes scanning the aircraft with practiced indifference. "Yes, sir. Pre-flight checks are complete. Fuel levels are optimal. We're good to go." Beckett nodded but didn't seem impressed. "Good. Keep your head down today. This isn't the kind of crowd you want to piss off." Red understood what he meant. The passengers they were flying today weren't just wealthy, they were powerful. Men who owned media empires, financial institutions, and political influence. People who decided who succeeded and who disappeared. Beckett patted his shoulder before heading toward the cockpit. "You've got a good thing going, Calloway. Don't let ambition trip you up." Rhett watched him go, feeling the weight of those words. Ambition. That's what had gotten him this far. That's what had kept him pushing when others told him he didn't belong in this world. He had no family name, no connections, just skill and persistence. As he climbed aboard, the flight attendants were already preparing for takeoff. The lead attendant, a woman named Claire, nodded at him. "Looks like a full house today," she said, motioning toward the cabin. Rhett glanced down the aisle where the elite of the elite were settling into their seats. Expensive suits, designer watches, hushed conversations about stock markets and mergers. Among them, he spotted a man who didn't quite fit the mold. Seated near the window was a tall, well-dressed black man, alone reading a newspaper. Unlike the others, he wasn't engaged in casual arrogance or exchanging business pleasantries. He seemed, separate from the rest. "Who's that?" Rhett asked, nodding toward the man. Claire lowered her voice. "Malcolm Hayes. Billionaire, but not their kind of billionaire. Old money, but built it himself. Owns a financial firm, does a lot of work in philanthropy." Rhett raised an eyebrow. He had heard the name before, but never thought much about it. He could already tell that Malcolm wasn't fully accepted by the others. "Anyway," Claire continued, "just make sure everything runs smoothly. These guys don't tolerate mistakes." Rhett nodded, heading toward the cockpit. He wasn't concerned about mistakes. He never made them. What concerned him was the unspoken rule that hung in the air. This wasn't just about flying a plane. It was about knowing your place, and Rhett Calloway had never been good at that. The engines roared to life as the private jet taxied onto the runway, the golden morning light casting long shadows across the tarmac. Inside the cockpit, Rhett Calloway ran through the final pre-flight procedures with Captain Beckett, his hands steady on the controls. This part, the precision, the focus, the quiet hum of the instruments, was what he loved most about flying. Everything else, the politics, the power games, the arrogance of the ultra-wealthy, he could do without. "Miami Tower, this is Gulfstream N-47X requesting clearance for takeoff," Beckett said into the radio. "Gulfstream N-47X, You are cleared for takeoff. Safe flight. With a final glance at the instruments, Beckett pushed the throttle forward, and the plane surged down the runway. Rhett felt the familiar pull as the wheels lifted off the ground, the heavy machine surrendering to the sky. A few seconds later, they were airborne, climbing steadily over the Florida coastline. Another smooth departure, Beckett muttered, adjusting the autopilot. He glanced at Rhett. All right, rookie, let's just get this over with. Keep an ear on the cabin, but don't get involved in anything. Rhett nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Beckett meant by anything. He had flown VIPs before, but there was something about today's flight that felt different. An hour into the flight, the cabin was quiet except for the occasional clinking of ice in glasses and murmured conversations about markets and acquisitions. The flight attendants moved efficiently, catering to their high-profile guests. Rhett sat back, monitoring the controls when Claire's voice came through the intercom. Flight deck, we have a situation. Beckett pressed the button. What kind of situation? It's a medical emergency. Passenger in 3A is in distress. Rhett frowned. 3A? That was Malcolm Hayes. Beckett sighed heavily, already annoyed. All right, I'll send Calloway back there. Let's hope it's nothing serious. Rhett unbuckled and made his way to the main cabin. The moment he stepped in, he felt the shift in energy. The usual casual arrogance of the passengers had been replaced with something colder. Malcolm Hayes sat hunched forward, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, his breath coming in shallow gasps. A flight attendant knelt beside him, looking helpless. What's happening? Rhett asked, kneeling down. I don't know, Malcolm rasped, his voice strained. Chest. Tight. Rhett's pulse quickened. He wasn't a doctor, but he had seen enough medical emergencies to recognize the signs. This looked like a heart attack. He turned to Claire. Get the emergency medical kit, now. Before she could move, a voice cut through the air like a knife. This is ridiculous, Pierce Wainwright, the most powerful man in the cabin, snapped. We're not diverting this plane for one man. Rhett looked up to see Wainwright standing near the aisle, arms crossed, his expression one of pure disdain. The other passengers, mostly men in tailored suits, exchanged glances but said nothing. This man needs medical attention, Rhett said, keeping his voice controlled. He needs to wait until we land, Wainwright countered. We have a schedule to keep. We're not stopping for a minor inconvenience. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Rhett's stomach twisted. This isn't a minor inconvenience, he shot back. He's having a heart attack. If we don't land now, he might not make it. Wainwright scoffed. Do you even know who you're talking to? I don't care what your job is. This isn't your decision to make. Rhett's jaw tightened. He looked at Malcolm, whose breathing had worsened. He didn't have time to argue. We're diverting, he said, standing up. But Wainwright took a step closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. If you do that, he said, you can forget about ever flying again. I will personally see to it that you never set foot in a cockpit for the rest of your life. Rhett felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He had worked his entire life to get here. If he lost this job, he lost everything. But then he looked down at Malcolm, his face pale, his hands gripping the armrests like he was holding on for dear life. There was no decision to be made. Rhett turned on his heel and stormed back to the cockpit. Beckett, he said, his voice firm. We need to land now. Beckett frowned. What? Medical emergency. Passenger in cardiac distress. I'm calling for an emergency landing. Beckett hesitated, glancing toward the main cabin. The passengers won't like that. I don't care. Beckett studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. All right, your call. Rhett grabbed the radio. Phoenix Tower, this is Gulfstream N-47X, declaring a medical emergency, requesting immediate landing clearance. A pause, then the response. Gulfstream N-47X, you are cleared for emergency landing at Phoenix Sky Harbor. Runway 2L ambulance will be standing by. Rhett nodded, setting the course. The engines shifted as the plane began its descent. Back in the cabin, the passengers were whispering, irritated. Wainwright's face was a mask of quiet rage. Rhett ignored them. Malcolm Hayes was going to live, and whatever happened next, Rhett would deal with it when the wheels touched the ground. The cabin was tense. Conversations had died down, replaced by quiet murmurs and the occasional scoff of irritation. The smooth flight had been interrupted, and that alone was enough to agitate the privileged men in their tailored suits. But Rhett Calloway wasn't focused on them. His attention was locked on the numbers on the cockpit screen, the descent rate, the airspeed, everything that would get them safely onto the ground before it was too late. Phoenix Tower, Gulfstream N-47X on approach. Runway 2L, he spoke into the radio, his voice steady despite the storm brewing behind him. Copy, N-47X. Winds are light, visibility clear. Medical team is standing by. Beside him, Captain Beckett let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the throttle. You really know how to stir things up, Calloway. Rhett didn't answer. He didn't have to. Beckett wasn't stopping him. That was enough. The aircraft glided downward, slicing through the thin clouds as the desert city sprawled below them. The mountains in the distance stood in contrast to the golden-brown landscape, heat waves distorting the horizon. The airfield loomed ahead, welcoming and unforgiving all at once. We're locked in, Rhett muttered, guiding the descent. One shot, Beckett nodded. Let's not make it a bad one. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical groan. The aircraft touched down, smooth despite the urgency. A light jolt rippled through the cabin as rubber met asphalt. Then the engines reverse thrust, slowing them down as they roared against the ground. They had made it. But as Rhett exhaled, his relief was short-lived. A slow clap echoed from the cabin behind them. Pierce Wainwright. Rhett's grip on the throttle tightened as he turned to see the man standing just outside the cockpit entrance, his smug expression impossible to miss. Congratulations, Wainwright said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You've officially derailed the plans of some of the most powerful men in the country. I hope it was worth it. Rhett unbuckled his harness and stood, squaring his shoulders. I'd do it again. Wainwright smirked. I expected as much. That's the problem with people like you. You think principle is more important than power. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so that only Rhett could hear. You just cost yourself everything. I'm going to make sure you never fly again. Before Rhett could respond, Claire's voice cut in. Move aside. We need to get him out now. Malcolm Hayes was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his body limp as two paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. They lifted him carefully, maneuvering through the aisle toward the waiting ambulance outside. Rhett followed them to the door, watching as Malcolm was loaded into the vehicle. He didn't know if the man would make it, but at least now he had a chance. Wainwright, meanwhile, turned his gaze toward Beckett. You allowed this. I expected better from you. Beckett, still in his seat, let out a tired sigh. I don't get paid enough to pick sides. Rhett clenched his jaw, his heart still racing as Wainwright shook his head and walked toward the exit. Before stepping off the aircraft, he paused. Oh, and Calloway? He didn't look back, but his voice was sharp. Enjoy your last flight. Then he was gone. The moment he stepped onto the tarmac, the rest of the passengers followed, grumbling among themselves, pulling out their phones, already contacting assistants and secretaries to rearrange their plans. Rhett stayed behind, looking at the empty cabin. He knew what was coming. The weight of it pressed against his chest like turbulence he couldn't escape. He had made the right choice. But in doing so, he had set himself on a collision course with a man who controlled the very sky he flew in. The sterile hum of the airport lounge was a stark contrast to the chaos Rhett Calloway knew was happening behind closed doors. He sat alone, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of an untouched cup of coffee. The Phoenix Sky Harbor Terminal was bustling, travelers moving in a blur of suitcases and fast food wrappers, voices overlapping in a steady stream of announcements and idle chatter. But for Rhett, the world had gone eerily still. Across the lounge, Captain Beckett sat in a leather chair, scrolling through his phone like this was just another delay. Claire, the lead flight attendant, had disappeared somewhere, no doubt avoiding the fallout, but Rhett wasn't avoiding anything. He was waiting for the inevitable. Calloway, the voice came from behind him, and he turned to see a man in a neatly pressed airline operations suit, Matthew Graves, the regional director for the private aviation company that had employed him. Graves was the kind of man who never raised his voice, but still had a way of making people feel like they had been summoned before a judge. Rhett stood. Sir. Graves didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, he motioned toward a quiet hallway. Let's talk. Rhett followed him, weaving through the terminal until they reached a private office. The second the door clicked shut, Graves turned, arms crossed. I just got off the phone with the board, he began, his tone devoid of warmth. They're not happy. Rhett had expected that. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the backlash would come. You disobeyed direct protocol by diverting the flight, Graves continued. You ignored the preferences of VIP clients and inconvenienced some of the most influential men in the country. Rhett inhaled sharply. A man was dying. Graves didn't flinch. And now your career is. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken finality. We're terminating your contract, effective immediately, Graves said. Rhett had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud still hit like an unexpected drop in altitude. I assume there's no appeal, Rhett said, keeping his voice even. Graves shook his head. Not when the complaints came from people who can crush this company with a phone call. He slid a document across the desk. This is your official termination notice. It also includes a non-disparagement clause. Sign it and you'll at least walk away quietly. Rhett didn't touch the paper. And if I don't sign? Graves sighed as if he were speaking to a naive child. Then I hope you enjoy never working in aviation again. The room was stifling, not because of the heat, but because of the sheer weight of the moment. Rhett looked at the paper, then back at Graves. He wanted to argue, to fight, but what was the point? The decision had been made long before this meeting, so he reached for the pen, scrawling his name at the bottom. Graves took the document, slipping it back into his briefcase with mechanical precision. Good luck, Calloway, he said, opening the door. Rhett stepped into the terminal, the hum of airport life resuming around him. But this time, he wasn't part of it. He was grounded, permanently, or at least that's what they thought. Because as Rhett walked toward the exit, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an unknown number. Normally, he wouldn't answer, but something told him this wasn't just a coincidence. He pressed the green button. A deep, measured voice spoke on the other end. Rhett Calloway, the voice said. This is Malcolm Hayes. We need to talk. Rhett stared at his phone for a beat, the name Malcolm Hayes still lingering in his mind. He had barely processed the voice before the line went dead, leaving only the hum of airport noise around him. The man he had risked everything for, now calling him directly. With nothing left to lose, Rhett stepped outside into the dry Arizona heat. The evening sun painted the sky in hues of burnt orange and soft violet as he flagged down a cab. Where to? The driver asked. Rhett hesitated, then checked the text that had followed the call. Wyndham Grand Hotel, penthouse suite, 8 p.m. Rhett exhaled, unsure whether he was walking into an opportunity or a mistake. Downtown, he said, leaning back against the worn seat. Wyndham Grand. The ride was silent, save for the occasional hum of the radio playing some soft jazz tune. The city lights flickered on as they neared the towering glass hotel, sleek and modern against the Phoenix skyline. Rhett stepped out, took a steadying breath, and entered the lobby. The receptionist didn't even ask for a name. Penthouse elevator is to your right, Mr. Calloway. Of course, Malcolm had already arranged everything. The elevator ride was quiet, the weight of uncertainty settling in Rhett's chest. As the door slid open, he was met with a luxurious suite, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city, a private bar stocked with the finest liquor, and in the center of it all, Malcolm Hayes, seated in a leather chair, a glass of whiskey in hand. Despite the opulence, Malcolm carried himself with an air of understated power. He wasn't dressed to impress, yet everything about him demanded attention. You look like a man who just lost everything, Malcolm said, motioning for Rhett to sit. Rhett smirked, stepping forward. You'd be right about that. Malcolm gestured toward the bar. Drink? Rhett shook his head. Not in the mood. Malcolm studied him for a long moment before setting his own glass down. I saw what you did up there. It took guts. Not many people stand up to men like Wainwright and walk away still breathing. Rhett exhaled through his nose. I didn't exactly walk away. More like got kicked off the plane. Malcolm chuckled. Yet here you are. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Why am I here, Mr. Hayes? Rhett finally asked. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because men like Wainwright don't take kindly to being embarrassed. You're not just unemployed, Rhett. You're blacklisted. Rhett felt his stomach tighten. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold wave through him. I figured, he muttered. So what now? Malcolm considered him for a moment before speaking. I need a man like you. Rhett frowned. For what exactly? Malcolm took his time before answering. Pierce Wainwright isn't just a businessman. He's a puppeteer. He pulls strings in places you wouldn't believe. Banking, politics, aviation, even law enforcement. The kind of power that operates in the shadows. Rhett folded his arms. And you want to take him down? A slow nod. I've spent years building a case against him. But people like him don't fall with lawsuits. They fall when the right people expose them. And you think I'm the right people? You're a man with nothing to lose, Malcolm said simply. That makes you dangerous. Rhett let that sit for a moment. He had spent his whole life following the rules, climbing the ladder the right way. And where had it gotten him? Grounded, cast aside like he never mattered. Maybe it was time to stop playing it safe. Rhett exhaled, leaning back. What do you need me to do? Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. First, he said, reaching into a leather briefcase at his side, you need to see just how deep this goes. He slid a folder across the table. Rhett stared at it, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything. Again, Rhett hesitated before picking up the folder. The weight of it in his hands felt heavier than paper alone. It was the weight of a choice, one that he knew couldn't be undone. Malcolm watched him, his expression unreadable. Take your time, he said, leaning back in his chair. But once you see what's inside, there's no going back. Rhett exhaled sharply, then flipped open the folder. The first page was a financial report. At least that's what it looked like. But the numbers didn't add up in a way that was normal. Funds were being shifted between companies that barely existed, accounts that were nothing more than digital ghosts, offshore transactions, shell corporations, all tied back to one name, Pierce Wainwright. Flipping through the pages, Rhett saw more than just financial misconduct. There were records of backroom deals, contracts pushed through under questionable circumstances, and the most damning of all, evidence of bribery at the highest levels of government and law enforcement. He looked up at Malcolm. How long have you been building this? Years, Malcolm said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Wainwright's not just corrupt. He's untouchable. Every time someone gets close, they disappear. Not literally, but their careers, their reputations. Sound familiar? Rhett clenched his jaw, flipping another page. A list of names, people who had tried to go up against Wainwright, journalists, former business partners, even politicians. Each one had been ruined in some way. I should have known, Rhett muttered. He didn't just want me fired. He wanted me erased. Malcolm nodded. He's done it before. You embarrassed him. That's not something men like him let slide. Rhett closed the folder. So what's your plan? Malcolm leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. We need to hit him where he can't recover. Not just expose him, but make it so that no amount of money or power can put him back on his feet. And you think I can help? You already did, Malcolm said simply. By standing up to him on that flight, you showed the world that he's not as untouchable as he thinks. People saw it, and more importantly, the right people saw it. Rhett frowned. What do you mean? Malcolm smirked. Wainwright isn't the only one with powerful friends. Before Rhett could respond, Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping a contact. After a brief pause, he spoke. He's ready. Rhett's stomach tightened. Who was that? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and grabbed his suit jacket. Let's take a ride, he said. It's time you met the people who actually want Wainwright gone. Rhett hesitated. He knew he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than himself. A part of him wanted to walk away, to find another path, to salvage what was left of his life. But another part, the part that had burned with anger since the moment Wainwright threatened him, knew he had already made his decision. He stood. Let's go. Malcolm nodded approvingly, leading him toward the elevator. As the doors slid shut, Rhett glanced at the folder still clutched in his hand. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was stepping into a war. The black sedan cruised through the Phoenix streets, its tinted windows shielding Rhett from the world outside. He sat in the back seat next to Malcolm, the folder still gripped in his hands. The city lights flickered past like fireflies, the hum of traffic and distant sirens filling the silence between them. "Where are we going?" Rhett finally asked, his voice steady but laced with unease. Malcolm exhaled, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere Wainwright's reach doesn't extend." The car wove through an industrial district before pulling into a dimly lit underground parking garage. The driver, a sharp-eyed man in a black jacket, stepped out and opened the door for them. Malcolm motioned for Rhett to follow. They entered a private elevator, the doors sliding shut with a quiet hiss. The descent was smooth, the air thick with an unspoken tension. When the doors reopened, they stepped in a room that looked nothing like what Rhett had expected. It wasn't some dark, smoke-filled hideout. It was a high-tech command center. Screens lined the walls displaying news reports, financial data, and encrypted messages. A handful of people sat at workstations, their eyes flickering between screens and keyboards, murmuring into headsets. At the center of it all stood a woman, her arms crossed, expression sharp as a scalpel. "You're late," she said, eyeing Malcolm before turning her gaze to Rhett. "Rhett Calloway," Malcolm said, gesturing toward her. "Meet Eleanor Vance." Rhett frowned. The name was familiar. Then it clicked. Senator Eleanor Vance. She had a reputation as one of the few politicians who actually went after corporate corruption. He straightened slightly. "Senator?" She studied him like she was assessing his worth. "You're the pilot." "That's me," he said, unsure if that was a compliment or an insult. Vance nodded toward the folder still clutched in his hands. "You've seen what's in there?" "Enough to know Wainwright's worse than I thought," Rhett admitted. "Then you understand why we're doing this," she said, stepping closer. "Wainwright isn't just a corrupt businessman. He's a systemic problem, and people like him don't get taken down with press releases." Rhett narrowed his eyes. "So what's the plan?" Malcolm and Vance exchanged a glance before Malcolm spoke. "We make sure that when Wainwright falls, he takes everyone protecting him down with him." Rhett glanced around the room, watching the analysts work. This wasn't just a few people angry at Wainwright. This was a full-scale operation. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "A long time," Vance confirmed, "but we needed the right moment, and thanks to you, that moment is now." Rhett frowned. "I don't get it. Why me? I'm just a pilot." Malcolm smirked. "Not anymore." Before Rhett could respond, one of the analysts called out, "We've got movement. Wainwright's lawyers just filed for an emergency injunction to suppress the financial documents we leaked." Vance's expression hardened. "Of course he did." Malcolm turned to Rhett. "This is how he operates. He'll try to buy time, bury evidence, intimidate witnesses. We have to stay ahead of him." Rhett exhaled, running a hand through his hair. A week ago, he had been worried about flight schedules and passenger complaints. Now he was part of something much bigger than himself. He looked back at Malcolm and Vance. "Tell me what I need to do." Vance's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Good," she said, "because we're about to make our first move." Rhett felt it, the shift in the air, the weight of the moment. He had just stepped onto a battlefield, and there was no turning back. The hum of monitors and the quiet tapping of keyboards filled the room, but Rhett barely heard it. He stood beside Malcolm and Senator Vance, his gaze fixed on the live feed of breaking news on one of the large screens. The headline scrolled across the bottom. "Billionaire Pierce Wainwright faces allegations of financial misconduct." It had begun. A well-dressed anchor spoke with calculated neutrality, but the weight behind her words was unmistakable. "Sources claim that Wainwright and his associates have been linked to offshore accounts and suspicious financial transfers, raising concerns over potential money laundering and corporate fraud." Rhett let out a slow breath. This was the first real shot. The world was watching now. Malcolm folded his arms. "That'll rattle him," Vance scoffed. "Rattle him? He's going to come after us with everything he's got." As if on cue, an analyst across the room called out, "Wainwright's team just issued a response, denying all allegations, calling it a political attack." "No surprise there," Malcolm muttered. Rhett clenched his jaw. "So what's next? We just wait for him to punch back?" Vance turned to him. Number? We keep moving? We have to force his hand. She walked over to one of the workstations and tapped the screen, pulling up a list of names. These are the people who keep Wainwright's empire running. Lawyers, financial officers, political backers. If we can get at least one of them to flip, we can break his entire operation. Rhett scanned the list, feeling a pit in his stomach. Some of these names belonged to people he had heard of before. High-ranking officials, corporate executives. They weren't just rich. They were the kind of people who never got touched. You're asking people to betray a man who could destroy them, Rhett said. Exactly, Malcolm replied. That's why we need the right leverage. Rhett's stomach turned at the word. Leverage. He wasn't naive. He knew this was how the world worked. But it was one thing to expose corruption. It was another to start playing the same game as the people they were trying to take down. Still, Wainwright had already set the rules. One of the analysts spoke up. We might have something. Nathaniel Carter, Wainwright's former financial strategist. He left the company last year under mysterious circumstances. Rhett frowned. He was pushed out. Most likely, Vance said. He hasn't spoken publicly, but sources say he had a falling out with Wainwright over an internal power struggle. If there's anyone who might want revenge, it's him. Malcolm nodded. Then let's pay him a visit. Rhett hesitated. And if he won't talk? Malcolm met his gaze. Then we make him. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. For the first time, Rhett wondered just how far they were willing to go, and how far he was willing to follow. 3 hours later, Rhett found himself outside a gated estate on the outskirts of Scottsdale, Arizona. The house was modern, all glass and steel, sitting behind a long stretch of pristine driveway. Nathaniel Carter was wealthy, just not Wainwright-level wealthy. But if he had been a key figure in Wainwright's operations, then he had secrets worth protecting. Malcolm pulled the car to a stop. We go in, we ask nicely. If that doesn't work, we ask differently. Vance smirked. That's your way of saying we lean on him. Malcolm didn't deny it. Rhett exhaled, stepping out of the car. He wasn't sure how he had gone from flying planes to showing up at people's doors looking for leverage. But here he was. They approached the front entrance, and Malcolm pressed the intercom. A few seconds later, a voice crackled through. I don't do visitors. Malcolm leaned in. It's Malcolm Hayes, and we need to talk. A pause. Then the gate buzzed open. That was easy, Rhett muttered. Malcolm smirked. Not yet. Inside, the house was pristine but cold, more a display of wealth than a home. Nathaniel Carter stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of scotch in hand. He was in his early 50s, his suit tailored to perfection, his expression carefully neutral. I should have known someone like you would come knocking, Carter said. Malcolm took a seat across from him. We both know Wainwright's days are numbered. The only question is whether you want to go down with him. Carter let out a dry laugh. You think he's finished because of a few news articles? Please. Vance leaned forward. We have more than articles. Carter took a sip of his drink, studying them. I left Wainwright's circle for a reason, but that doesn't mean I'm stupid enough to stand in his way. Rhett watched the exchange, feeling like he was witnessing a chess game where every move was a gamble. Malcolm leaned back. Let me put it another way. How much do you value your freedom? Carter's smirk faltered. Malcolm reached into his pocket, pulled out a tablet, and slid it across the table. We have evidence linking you to offshore transactions made under Wainwright's directive. Maybe you weren't the mastermind, but legally you were involved. And if this goes public, Wainwright will throw you under the bus without hesitation. Carter's fingers tightened around his glass. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. That's blackmail, he muttered. Malcolm shrugged. It's leverage. Same thing Wainwright would use against you if the roles were reversed. Silence stretched. Rhett could almost hear the gears turning in Carter's mind. Finally, Carter exhaled. If I help you, I want protection. Vance nodded. We can arrange that. Another pause. Then Carter drained his drink and set the glass down. All right, he said. I'll tell you what you need to know. Rhett exhaled. They had their first defector, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into something far bigger than they could control, and Wainwright wasn't the type to lose without a fight. Nathaniel Carter sat back in his chair, fingers drumming against the rim of his empty glass. He was considering his next words carefully. Rhett could tell. This wasn't just some business negotiation. It was a matter of survival. "I'll talk," Carter said finally. "But you need to understand something. If Wainwright finds out I helped you, I won't be around to regret it." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Then don't give us half-truths. The only way out is all the way out." Carter exhaled, glancing toward the massive windows that overlooked the Scottsdale skyline. He looked like a man measuring the distance of a fall before deciding whether to jump. Then he spoke. "Wainwright has off-the-books accounts, real ones, not the distractions he feeds to regulators. He launders money through a network of dummy investors, but the real power sits in a private ledger." Vance narrowed her eyes. "And you have access to that ledger?" Carter hesitated. "I used to, before I was pushed out, but I know where it is." Malcolm's expression darkened. "Where?" Carter exhaled through his nose, weighing his options one last time. Then he said, "It's kept on a secure server, not online. Physical storage, inside his private office." Rhett felt his stomach drop. "So you're saying we'd have to break in?" Carter gave a humorless chuckle. I'm saying you'd have to be suicidal." Silence filled the room. This wasn't just leaking documents or playing with media narratives. This was direct action, and it was dangerous as hell. Vance sighed, rubbing her temples. "So let me get this straight. Wainwright keeps the most incriminating evidence of his crimes in an actual room, not on some offshore cloud server?" Carter nodded. "He's paranoid. He doesn't trust encryption. Keeps physical backups locked away." Malcolm exchanged a glance with Vance. "We get our hands on that, and Wainwright is finished." Carter scoffed. "You make it sound easy." "It never is," Malcolm muttered. Rhett leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "All right, so let's assume we somehow get inside Wainwright's office and retrieve this thing. What's stopping him from bearing the fallout?" Vance gestured toward the screens displaying financial news. "Because we'll be making sure it goes public in a way he can't control. Think congressional hearings, federal indictments, the kind of scandal no amount of money can fix." Carter shook his head. "Even if you get the ledger, Wainwright will know where it came from." He turned to Malcolm. "And he'll come after me." Malcolm didn't flinch. "Then we make sure you're already out of his reach." Carter exhaled sharply. "I hope you're better at this than he is." Malcolm stood. "So do I." By the time Rhett, Malcolm, and Vance left Carter's home, the desert sky had faded into a deep blue, the heat giving way to the cooler night air. Rhett followed Malcolm to his car, hands shoved into his pockets. "You actually think this will work?" Rhett asked. Malcolm opened the driver's side door but didn't get in yet. "I think it has to." Rhett studied him. "You ever done something like this before?" Malcolm met his gaze. "I've played my share of dangerous games." Rhett exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "And what happens if we lose?" Malcolm smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then Wainwright makes sure none of us play again." That wasn't exactly comforting. Rhett climbed into the passenger seat, watching the city lights blur past as they drove. He had no illusions about what they were stepping into now. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt businessman. It was about surviving him. And Wainwright had just been given a reason to strike first. The air inside the high-rise conference room was heavy, thick with cigar smoke and the quiet hum of men who had grown used to control. Pierce Wainwright sat at the head of a long, polished oak table, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. The walls of his private office were lined with books he never read, awards he had bought, and paintings worth more than some people's entire lives. Across from him, a team of high-powered lawyers and corporate advisors waited in tense silence. They knew better than to speak before Wainwright was ready. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, eyes cold. "Who talked?" A man in a pinstripe suit hesitated before responding. We're not sure, sir." Wainwright exhaled sharply through his nose, his patience thinning. "Don't insult me. Someone leaked those documents." His voice was low, but the threat in it was unmistakable. "Find out who." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "We're already investigating, but we suspect Nathaniel Carter might be involved." Wainwright's jaw tightened. Carter. He should have seen this coming. The man had always been too ambitious for his own good. He had let Carter walk away once, thinking the man knew better than to cross him. That mistake wouldn't be repeated. And what about the pilot? Wainwright continued. Calloway? A different advisor, a younger man who still believed he was invincible, cleared his throat. We weren't expecting him to be a problem, sir, but he's involved. Hayes brought him in. Wainwright's lips curled in distaste. Rhett Calloway was a nobody, a worker bee. He should have been easy to squash. But now he was becoming an irritation, and Wainwright didn't tolerate irritations. Handle it, he ordered, rising to his feet. The men at the table nodded in unison, eager to leave, eager to escape his growing fury. As they filed out, Wainwright walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, looking down at the city that he had spent years building his empire upon. No one took from him and walked away unscathed. Not Carter, not Malcolm Hayes, and certainly not Rhett Calloway. Rhett's hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly as he pulled into the underground parking garage beneath Malcolm's office building. He had barely slept since their meeting with Carter, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him like turbulence at 30,000 feet. He shut off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, watching the red glow of the brake lights ahead of him flicker against the concrete walls. This was it. Once he stepped out of this car, there was no going back. With a slow breath, he pushed the door open and made his way to the private elevator, where a security guard nodded him through. The ride up was smooth, but his nerves weren't. When the doors opened, Malcolm was already waiting. He had a phone pressed to his ear, his expression sharp, calculating. The moment he saw Rhett, he gestured for him to follow. Vance was already inside, standing near a table cluttered with documents, blueprints, and security schematics. We have a problem, Malcolm said as he ended his call. Vance exhaled sharply. I'll say, Wainwright's moving faster than we expected. Rhett frowned. What do you mean? She tapped a document on the table. He just froze Carter's accounts. Every single one. And I don't mean through legal means. I mean his assets are locked, inaccessible. Wainwright is sending a message. Rhett swore under his breath. So Carter's a dead man if we don't act fast. Malcolm nodded. And so are we if we don't get to that ledger first. The room fell into a heavy silence. The plan had been dangerous before, but now it was a race against time. Vance folded her arms. We go in tomorrow night. Rhett blinked. That soon? We don't have a choice, Malcolm said. Wainwright will be expecting us to hesitate. We need to move before he tightens security even further. Rhett rubbed a hand down his face. All right, walk me through it. Vance gestured to the blueprint. Wainwright's private office is on the top floor of his corporate headquarters. We've confirmed the ledger is kept in a biometric safe, meaning we either need his fingerprints or a way to bypass the system. Rhett's stomach tightened. And how do we plan to do that? Malcolm smirked. That's where things get fun. Rhett wasn't sure he liked Malcolm's definition of fun, but one thing was certain. By this time tomorrow, they would either have the evidence they needed to destroy Wainwright, or they'd be the ones destroyed instead. The night air was thick with tension as Rhett stood in the shadow of Wainwright's towering headquarters. From the outside, the building was an architectural masterpiece, sleek glass panels reflecting the city's golden glow, its corporate insignia standing tall above the entrance, like a declaration of untouchable power. But tonight, that power was about to be challenged. Rhett shifted his weight, adjusting the earpiece Malcolm had given him earlier. Tell me again why I'm the one going in. Malcolm's voice crackled through the line, calm and amused. Because Calloway, you've spent your whole life handling high-pressure situations. You can think fast, stay calm under fire, and most importantly, Wainwright doesn't know to expect you. Yet, Vance muttered over comms, if we screw this up, he'll know soon enough. Rhett took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the security checkpoints. Guards at the front, cameras along the perimeter, the kind of setup designed to keep people like him out. How's our access? He asked. Malcolm's voice came back, steady. We have a 10-minute window before the security feed loops. After that, you're on your own. Rhett exhaled, no turning back now. He moved quickly, slipping past the first checkpoint using a stolen ID badge Malcolm had procured. The first phase was easy, an employee entrance, minimal scrutiny. Once inside, he kept his pace even, heading toward the elevators as if he belonged there. The key to this kind of infiltration wasn't stealth, it was confidence. "All right, Calloway, listen up," Vance said in his ear. "Wainwright's office is on the top floor. His biometric safe is inside, and Carter's intel says the ledger is in there. You need to get in, extract the files, and get out before security catches on." "No pressure," Rhett muttered. He reached the elevator and swiped the stolen ID card. The screen blinked red. "Access denied." Rhett clenched his jaw. "We've got a problem." Malcolm swore under his breath. "Try it again." Rhett swiped a second time. The same result. "We're out of time," Vance warned. "Security feed resets in 5 minutes." Rhett's pulse quickened, his mind racing. He scanned the panel, then his eyes landed on the emergency access keypad, a manual override. He keyed in the standard security bypass code. Nothing. Then he tried something else. He had seen it before, on high-end aircraft security panels, a manufacturer override, a backdoor left in the system for maintenance purposes. 6-0-5-9, a soft beep. Then, the door slid open. "You're in," Malcolm confirmed. "Move!" Rhett stepped inside, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored elevator walls. He had never been a thief, never been on this side of the law. But right now, the only law that mattered was stopping Wainwright. As the elevator ascended, he adjusted the gloves on his hands. He wasn't sure if they would help against the biometric locks, but it was worth a shot. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the top floor. Silent, empty, pristine. Wainwright's office was at the far end of the hall, past a row of glass-walled conference rooms. Rhett moved carefully, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. "This is too easy," he murmured. "Don't jinx it," Vance shot back. Reaching the heavy oak doors of Wainwright's office, Rhett tested the handle. Locked. He pulled out the small electronic device Malcolm had given him, something that would override basic security locks. He pressed it against the panel. A moment later, a soft click echoed in the silence. The door swung open. Inside, the office was exactly what he expected. Minimalist, cold, a temple to wealth and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city below, but Rhett had no time for sightseeing. His eyes landed on the safe. "All right, I'm at the safe," he whispered. Malcolm's voice came through. "Carter said it's fingerprint locked, with a secondary passcode." Rhett swallowed. "And you have the passcode?" "Working on it," Vance said. Rhett reached into his pocket, pulling out a small transparent strip, something Malcolm had arranged. It contained a partial fingerprint lifted from a glass Wainwright had used at a gala months ago. "Here goes nothing." He pressed the strip against the biometric scanner. Nothing. "Damn it," he hissed. "Try again," Malcolm urged. Rhett repositioned the strip, angling it slightly differently. He pressed down. A green light flashed. The lock clicked open. He exhaled. "I'm in." He pulled the door open and scanned the contents. Files, hard drives. And then, there it was. A thick black binder, labeled only with a single word. Ledger. He grabbed it and turned. Then the office lights flickered on. A voice rang out behind him, slow and amused. "Well, well." Rhett froze. Standing in the doorway was Pierce Wainwright, and he wasn't alone. Rhett's grip tightened around the ledger as he turned to face Pierce Wainwright. The billionaire stood in the doorway, his posture relaxed, his expression one of quiet amusement. But the real threat stood behind him, 2 security guards armed and alert. "Quite the unexpected guest," Wainwright mused, stepping further into the office, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood. "I should be flattered." Rhett's mind raced, calculating his next move. The gunmen hadn't drawn their weapons yet, which meant Wainwright wasn't ready to escalate, at least not immediately. He forced himself to stay calm. "Wasn't planning on staying long." Wainwright smirked. "I imagine not. But you see, Calloway, when a man breaks into my office and attempts to steal something very, very important to me, I feel obligated to extend the invitation." Rhett's earpiece crackled. Malcolm's voice was tight. You're boxed in. Keep him talking. Wainwright gestured toward the ledger in Rhett's hands. You must be proud of yourself. A pilot of all people, managing to slip past my security. Clever. But I have to ask, did you really think this would end well for you? Rhett clenched his jaw. I think you're scared. That got a reaction. Wainwright's expression didn't falter, but the amusement in his eyes darkened. You think because you have that, he nodded toward the ledger, that you've won? You have no idea what game you're even playing, do you? Rhett kept his stance firm, hiding the uncertainty clawing at his chest. Looks to me like you're the one trying to convince himself he's still in control. Wainwright let out a low chuckle. Control isn't something men like me lose, Calloway. You see, no matter how much noise you and Hayes make, the truth is, the system is built for people like me. You could leak that ledger to every news station in the country, and within a week, it wouldn't matter. Rhett's fingers curled around the leather-bound book. He wanted to believe that wasn't true, that exposing Wainwright's corruption would mean something. But the confidence in Wainwright's voice was unsettling. He glanced toward the doorway. The guards were still in position, waiting for their order. His earpiece crackled again. This time, it was Vance. Rhett, the fire alarm. There's a manual pull station to your left. Rhett didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he pivoted, reaching for the red alarm handle on the wall. He yanked it down hard. A split second of silence, then a deafening whoop, whoop, whoop as flashing red lights filled the office. The guards reacted immediately, their hands going for their weapons. But Rhett was already moving. He threw himself toward the nearest window, the ledger gripped tightly in one hand. With all the force he could muster, he smashed the binder against the glass. It didn't shatter, but it cracked. Wainwright cursed. Stop him! The guards lunged, but Rhett swung the ledger again. This time, the reinforced glass gave way, sending shards raining down to the streets below. The cityscape stretched out before him, dizzying and unforgiving. He didn't have time to think. Rhett, you need to jump. Malcolm's voice was sharp in his ear. Rhett took a breath, and then he was airborne. The rush of wind tore at his clothes as he plummeted downward, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. For a split second, panic clawed at his chest, until suddenly his descent was yanked to a halt. The zip line Malcolm had set up caught, sending him sliding rapidly toward the adjacent rooftop. Behind him, Wainwright's furious shouts were drowned out by the wail of alarms. Rhett hit the rooftop hard, rolling to absorb the impact. He clutched the ledger to his chest, sucking in a breath as adrenaline surged through his veins. Then he pushed himself to his feet and ran. The getaway car was already waiting in a side alley. The moment Rhett slid into the back seat, Malcolm hit the gas. Nice of you to drop in, he said, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Rhett let out a shaky breath, tossing the ledger onto the seat between them. Hope it was worth it. Vance, her sitting in the passenger seat, flipped open the binder, scanning the contents. Oh, she murmured. This was worth it. Malcolm glanced at Rhett through the rearview mirror. Then we just started a war. Rhett exhaled, running a hand through his hair as the city lights blurred past. Good, he said, because he was ready to finish it. The safe house was quiet, save for the rustling of papers and the low hum of a distant train cutting through the night. Rhett sat at the wooden table, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the ledger they had risked everything to steal. Across from him, Vance flipped through the pages with meticulous care, her brow furrowed in concentration. Malcolm stood near the window, watching the city through the slit in the blinds, his posture tense. This is it, Vance said, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't just a ledger, it's a kill switch. Rhett leaned forward. How bad is it? She exhaled sharply. Worse than we thought. Offshore accounts, dummy corporations, millions in illegal transfers. But this isn't just about money laundering. This ties Wainwright to bribery, fraud, and political manipulation on a scale we didn't anticipate. Malcolm turned from the window. Explain. Vance tapped the pages. There are payments to sitting senators, judges, even law enforcement officials. And look at this. She flipped the binder toward them, pointing to a set of documents. These aren't just transactions. These are orders. Rhett frowned. Orders? Directives, she clarified. Wainwright wasn't just bribing people. He was orchestrating policy changes, influencing judicial rulings, even directing investigations. He's been engineering the system to protect himself for years. Malcolm let out a low whistle. So if this gets out, Vance nodded. It won't just bring him down. It'll expose an entire network of corruption. People who have spent their careers making sure men like him stay untouchable. Rhett clenched his jaw. He had known Wainwright was powerful, but this wasn't just about one man. This was about dismantling an entire infrastructure built to shield the elite from accountability. So how do we make sure this sticks, he asked. Vance exchanged a glance with Malcolm. We go public, full-scale release. News networks, government agencies, independent watchdog groups. If we hit all of them at once, Wainwright won't have time to contain it. Malcolm folded his arms. And what happens when they try to bury it anyway? Vance's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we make sure there's nowhere for them to hide. Rhett let out a breath. This was it, the final stretch. We move at dawn, Malcolm said. Rhett nodded, his grip tightening around the ledger. There was no turning back now. The plan was simple. Hit every major news outlet, leak the documents to key reporters, and flood social media before Wainwright's team could react. But they weren't the only ones making moves. At exactly 4:13 a.m., the first blow landed. The safe house's security system blared to life, red lights flashing against the dark walls. A second later, a distant explosion rocked the building's foundation. Go, go, go! Malcolm shouted, grabbing the ledger and shoving it into a reinforced bag. Rhett was already moving. He grabbed his sidearm, one he had hoped he wouldn't need, and followed Malcolm and Vance as they sprinted through the back exit. The alley was eerily quiet, too quiet. Then, gunfire. Bullets tore into the brick behind them as masked men emerged from the shadows, their weapons flashing in the dim streetlights. Wainwright's people, Vance growled, ducking behind a dumpster as another round of shots rang out. Malcolm pulled Rhett to cover. They're not here to scare us, he muttered. They're here to erase us. Rhett clenched his teeth. Then let's not make it easy. He peeked around the corner, counting at least 5 men. Professional, tactical, not the kind of people who hesitated. We need an exit, Vance said, her breath steady despite the chaos. Rhett spotted a fire escape along the side of an old industrial building. Up there! They moved as one, sprinting toward the ladder as bullets ricocheted around them. Rhett was the first to climb, followed by Vance, then Malcolm. One of the gunmen broke from cover, raising his rifle. Rhett fired first. The man crumpled, his weapon clattering onto the pavement. They reached the rooftop, their lungs burning. From this height, they could see the black SUVs parked at both ends of the street. Wainwright's people were locking the city down. We need to split up, Malcolm said. Rhett frowned. That's a bad idea. It's the only idea, Vance countered. They're hunting us. If we stay together, we're a target. If we split, we have a chance. Malcolm tossed the reinforced bag to Rhett. You get the ledger out. Rhett caught it, eyes narrowing. And what about you? Malcolm smirked. I'll be fine. Vance nodded. Meet at the fallback point in 12 hours. Rhett hesitated. He didn't like this. But there was no time to argue. See you there, he said. Then he ran. The city blurred around him as he sprinted toward the edge of the rooftop, leaping to the next building just as more gunfire erupted behind him. He didn't stop, didn't look back, because right now the only thing that mattered was keeping the truth alive and making sure Pierce Wainwright burned with it. Rhett's boots pounded against the gravel-coated rooftop, the weight of the ledger strapped tight to his back. Behind him, the sound of gunfire still echoed through the alley, but he didn't stop to see if they were following. He already knew the answer. Pierce Wainwright wasn't just trying to silence them, he was trying to erase them. His breath came hard as he leaped across a narrow gap between 2 buildings, landing hard on the other side. His knees buckled slightly, but he pushed forward. The city stretched out below him, glittering with neon signs and headlights, oblivious to the war being fought above. His earpiece crackled to life. Malcolm. Calloway, where are you? On the move. Rhett ducked behind an air conditioning unit, pressing his back against the metal. They cut us off from the cars. I'm heading south, trying to get out of the kill zone. Malcolm cursed. They must have known we were in the safe house. Someone gave us up. Rhett clenched his jaw. We don't have time for that right now. A voice interrupted their conversation, cold and smug. "You can run, Calloway, but we both know how this ends." Rhett's stomach twisted. Wainwright. The earpiece had been compromised. Malcolm swore under his breath. "Cut the line, he's tracking us." Rhett ripped the device from his ear and crushed it under his boot. But Wainwright's words lingered. He knew, and that meant there wasn't much time. He made it 3 more blocks before he realized he was being hunted. 2 SUVs rolled slowly along the side streets, their tinted windows barely reflecting the streetlights above. A man on a motorcycle followed farther back, keeping his distance, watching. They weren't trying to kill him here. They were hurting him. Rhett took a sharp turn into a construction site, weaving through steel beams and half-built scaffolding. His boots crunched against the loose dirt as he moved fast, ducking behind a stack of wooden pallets just as headlights flooded the space. A car door slammed, then another. Rhett gritted his teeth, his pulse hammering as the sound of approaching footsteps filled the space around him. "Mr. Calloway." Pierce Wainwright's voice was smooth, calm, a man who knew he had already won. Rhett stayed hidden, tightening his grip on the strap of the bag. He could feel the weight of the ledger pressing against his spine. "You've made quite the mess," Wainwright continued, his voice growing closer. "I have to admit, I underestimated you. I thought you were just some pilot, disposable. But here you are, still breathing." Rhett exhaled slowly. His heart was telling him to run, but his gut told him something else. Wainwright wasn't rushing this. He wanted Rhett to hear him. "I want you to think about something," Wainwright said. "Right now you're clutching that little book like it's going to change the world, like it's your shield. But you and I both know that's not true." Rhett didn't move. "This ledger?" Wainwright continued, almost amused. "It's a loose thread in a much larger tapestry. And yes, if you get it to the right people, it might cause me some headaches, maybe even knock me down a few notches. But here's the part you're not ready to accept." Silence stretched between them. "No matter what happens to me," Wainwright finally said, his voice sharper now, "the system stays the same. You think I'm the disease, but I'm just a symptom. You cut me down, and another man takes my place. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." Rhett's fingers curled into a fist. "You still have a choice," Wainwright said. "Drop the ledger. Walk away. Be smart." Rhett's jaw tightened. He was done walking away. In one swift motion, he grabbed the nearest metal pipe from the ground and swung it with full force against the floodlight nearest him. The glass shattered, plunging the area into a deeper darkness. And then he ran. Bullets ripped through the air behind him as he vaulted over a pile of concrete slabs, ducking low as he zigzagged through the maze of unfinished structures. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. His breath burned in his lungs as he reached the edge of the site. A chain-link fence loomed ahead, topped with barbed wire. No time to hesitate. He jumped, scrambling up the metal links, the bag slamming against his back as he moved. A gunshot rang out, too close. Pain exploded across his shoulder as the bullet grazed him, tearing through fabric and flesh. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself over the top of the fence before dropping to the other side. He hit the ground hard, but he didn't stop. He pushed forward, clutching his bleeding shoulder, weaving into the alleyway beyond. Behind him, he could hear Wainwright's men shouting, but they weren't climbing after him. They had let him go, because they knew what he didn't. Rhett had just run straight into a trap, and Wainwright was waiting. Rhett barely made it a block before the SUV screeched to a stop in front of him, cutting off his escape. His injured shoulder throbbed, the blood soaking through his shirt. He tightened his grip on the bag, the weight of the ledger pressing against his back. The back door of the SUV swung open. Pierce Wainwright stepped out, buttoning his jacket with the precision of a man who never lost control. His expression was unreadable, his movements slow, deliberate. Behind him, 2 of his men emerged, hands resting casually on their concealed weapons. Rhett's breathing was heavy, his muscles screaming for rest, but he forced himself to stand tall. "That was quite the chase," Wainwright said, his tone almost conversational. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." Rhett swallowed the metallic taste of adrenaline. "And you're desperate. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." Wainwright smirked, but his eyes remained cold. "Desperation is for men who don't have options. I have plenty." His gaze flicked to the bag slung across Rhett's back. But you have exactly one. Red adjusted his stance, shifting his weight. That's so? Wainwright took a slow step forward. Hand over the ledger, and this ends. No press, no arrests. You walk away. Rhett let out a dry laugh. You really think I believe that? Wainwright sighed, shaking his head. It's always the same with people like you. You think you're the hero in some grand fight against corruption? That if you just expose the right people, the world will change. He tilted his head. But you and I both know that's not how it works. Rhett clenched his jaw. You sound nervous, Wainwright. The billionaire let out a low chuckle. Nervous? No, Calloway, I'm practical. His voice dropped slightly, colder now. You still think you have a way out of this? You don't. A black sedan pulled up behind Rhett, its headlights cutting through the alley shadows. A second vehicle. More of Wainwright's men. They weren't taking chances. Rhett's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He needed to move, now. His hand twitched toward the gun at his side. Wainwright caught the motion. His smirk widened. Think very carefully about what you do next. A tense silence hung between them. Then, a sharp crack split the air. One of Wainwright's men jerked backward, blood blooming across his chest as he crumpled to the ground. Gunfire erupted from the rooftop above. Malcolm. Move! Malcolm's voice shouted through an earpiece Rhett didn't realize was still working. Rhett didn't hesitate. He dropped low, rolling behind the nearest dumpster as bullets tore through the air around him. Wainwright's remaining bodyguard dove for cover, returning fire toward Malcolm's position. The alley was chaos. Rhett sprinted, pushing through the searing pain in his shoulder. He had to get out. Go left! Vance's voice cut through the static of his earpiece. There's a service tunnel ahead. He didn't ask how she knew. He just ran. Wainwright's voice roared behind him. Calloway! Rhett didn't turn back. He burst into the tunnel, the stale air hitting him like a wall. Footsteps pounded behind him. One of Wainwright's men had followed. Rhett ducked into the shadows, forcing his breathing to slow. A figure stepped inside, gun raised. Rhett struck first. He slammed his injured shoulder into the man's ribs, ignoring the white-hot pain as they crashed to the ground. The guard twisted, trying to bring the gun up. Rhett wrenched it from his grip, driving his elbow into the man's throat. The guard gagged, eyes wide, then went still. Rhett staggered backward, panting. His hands were shaking. Focus. Get out. He grabbed the discarded gun, then pushed forward through the tunnel. The exit loomed ahead, a steel door slightly ajar. Freedom. He shoved it open and walked straight into Wainwright. The billionaire stood alone, his usual smug composure cracked just slightly. His suit was dusted with alley grime, his tie loosened, but his gun was steady. Enough, Wainwright said, his voice low. This is where it ends, Calloway. Rhett's fingers tightened around the weapon in his grip. You think killing me solves your problem? Rhett asked, his breathing heavy. Wainwright smiled faintly. Not at all, but it ends yours. They stood there, guns raised, two men on opposite sides of a war neither was willing to lose. Then, a loud screech of tires echoed from the street behind Wainwright. The billionaire barely had time to turn before Malcolm's car slammed into him, sending him sprawling. Get in! Malcolm yelled. Rhett didn't hesitate. He jumped into the car as Vance pulled the door shut behind him. Malcolm gunned the engine, the tires screeching as they tore down the alleyway. Behind them, Wainwright lay motionless on the pavement. Rhett exhaled shakily, his pulse still hammering. Did we just... He's alive, Vance cut in. But not for long. We need to move now. Malcolm's jaw was tight as he drove. We have what we need. Time to finish this. Rhett leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a brief moment. It was almost over. But Wainwright wasn't a man who stayed down, and the real fight was still ahead. The safe house was alive with activity. Screens flickered with news reports. Encrypted messages pinged on laptops, and a sense of urgency hung heavy in the air. Rhett sat at the long wooden table, his shirt still stained with blood, the adrenaline still pulsing through his veins. Across from him, Vance was on the phone, her voice sharp, controlled. Malcolm stood at the head of the room, scanning the screens as information poured in. Pierce Wainwright was still alive. Rhett exhaled, running a hand down his face. So what now? We had him. We should have finished it back there. Malcolm shot him a look. That's not how this works. Rhett clenched his jaw. Then explain it to me. Vance hung up the phone and turned to them. Wainwright is moving fast. He's calling in favors, pulling strings. But the ledger is already out. She gestured toward the screens. Live news coverage was picking up the story. Anonymous sources have leaked a series of financial documents allegedly linking billionaire Pierce Wainwright to widespread fraud and political corruption. We got it to the right people, Vance continued. Investigative reporters, federal agencies, the kind of people even Wainwright can't bribe. Rhett shook his head. And what happens when he finds a way to spin it? He's survived worse, hasn't he? Malcolm smirked. Not this time. He tapped the screen, pulling up a new headline. Key witness to testify against Wainwright in federal investigation? Rhett's eyes widened. Carter? Vance nodded. He flipped. The second he saw that ledger hit the press, he knew Wainwright would use him as a scapegoat, so he's making sure he's on the right side of history. Malcolm folded his arms. The moment Carter takes the stand, it's over. Rhett wanted to believe that. He really did. But men like Wainwright didn't just lose. A phone rang. Vance answered. Her face hardened as she listened. Then she hung up and turned to them. Wainwright's been arrested. Silence filled the room. Rhett let out a slow breath, absorbing the weight of those words. Charges? Malcolm asked. Vance's lips curled into a rare smile. Fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. The DOJ is preparing a case that'll bury him. Rhett exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. We did it. Malcolm clapped him on the shoulder. No, Calloway. You did it. The weight that had been pressing on Rhett's chest for weeks suddenly lifted. Wainwright was done. The system that had protected him was crumbling. For the first time in a long time, Rhett felt like he could breathe again. 3 weeks later, the trial was a spectacle. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed, eager to document the downfall of one of the most powerful men in the country. Rhett watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, as Pierce Wainwright was led inside, flanked by federal agents. The man who had once threatened to erase him was now the one being erased. Vance stood beside him, arms crossed. He won't walk away from this. Rhett nodded. No, he won't. Malcolm approached, a knowing smirk on his face. So what's next for you, Calloway? Back to flying? Rhett considered that for a moment. He had spent his whole life chasing the sky. But now, he shook his head. I think it's time to do something more. Malcolm grinned. I had a feeling you'd say that. Vance handed him a file. There are plenty more Wainwrights out there. If you're up for it. Rhett smirked, flipping open the folder. His fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Final headline, Pierce Wainwright found guilty on all charges. Sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Rhett Calloway, from pilot to whistleblower, the man who took down a king. Power can build empires, but it can also destroy them. Rhett Calloway was never meant to win. He was supposed to stay in his place, follow orders, and look the other way. But sometimes one act of defiance is all it takes to expose the cracks in a system built on corruption. His story isn't just about taking down one man. It's about proving that no one is truly untouchable. So now we ask you, in a world where power protects power, what would you be willing to risk for the truth? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. There are more untold stories waiting to be heard, and we'll be here to tell them.